Hi everybody, I'm Joel Farkas, and I am a lecturer on the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War, the founding of our country. I'm also a volunteer docent, which is a fancy word for tour guide, at Washington's headquarters here in historic Morristown, New Jersey. Now, where I'm standing, if you walk down that way, you will come to Washington's headquarters, where George Washington actually lived for a little over 6 months during the Revolutionary War. If you go this way, you come up to the historic Morristown Green, and as you go all around here, there are a lot of different buildings and sites from events that happened during the Revolutionary War. So right behind me is the Morristown Diner. So let's go inside. I'm going to get a cup of coffee and we'll start doing some history. As I said outside, I actually do two things in my retirement years. The first is I am a lecturer on the American Revolution, before the Revolutionary War, and after the Revolutionary War. And I'm also a volunteer docent at Washington's headquarters here in Morristown, which is just down the road that-a-way. And I have a lot of fun doing this. I've been doing it for 6 years. And some really funny things have happened, and I want to share them with you, as well as history. This is the Ford Mansion, which is one of the key buildings in what's called Washington's headquarters. Behind the Ford Mansion is called the Museum, inside of which are a large number of Revolutionary War items, George Washington-related artifacts, a fabulous video on the winter that Washington stayed here, the winter the Army called the hard winter. Everything is free, by the way. There's no charge. Now, let's go back to the Ford Mansion. This building was constructed, it was finished in 1774 by Jacob Ford Jr. So here's a picture of course, the mansion itself. Now, I'm focusing in on the door. This building is about 90% original. Now, it's been maintained, of course. I mean, it's wood. It has to be maintained. Look at this beautiful door. It's called a Dutch door or a split door, where the top part opens and the bottom can open or stay shut. The point is, there's a similar one in the back and you get cross ventilation. So we're going to go inside. This is the hallway. Look at this hallway. Most of the wood here is original. Whatever the Park Service felt was unsafe, they replaced. As I said earlier, this building was constructed, it was built by Jacob Ford Jr. Jacob lived here with his wife Theodosia and 4 children, 3 boys and a girl. In 1775 in Philadelphia, we have the Second Continental Congress. During this period of time, number one, we declare independence. We don't declare war, we declare independence. Number two, Congress authorizes funds for a standing army. And number three, George Washington becomes commander-in-chief of that army. By the way, in part, large part, because of John Adams. Few people, I'm sorry to say, really know much about John Adams. I talk about him more in other lectures, but he's one of our founding fathers that really was very, very important in the founding of our country. And here's my first question. When did we declare independence? Most people say July 4th, 1776. But guess what? Most people are wrong. We declared independence on July 2nd, not July 4th. So, you ask yourself, all right, so where does July 4th come from? So let's go back a little bit. We're going to go back to June of 1776. And Richard Henry Lee stands up in front of Congress. By the way, Congress back then was one house. It's not as it is today. Congress is two houses. So Richard Henry Lee stands up, and in the Lee resolutions, these United Colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Now, a resolution is on the floor. That resolution is debated and then it's voted upon. And if that resolution passes, we have just declared independence from Britain. Now, the president of Congress was John Hancock. So in anticipation of this resolution passing, Hancock appoints a 5-man committee to draft a declaration, a written document explaining what this entire revolution is all about, this new philosophy on government and human interaction. So the five-man committee is John Adams, there he is again, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. But the draft was mostly written by Thomas Jefferson. And so we have the debate, and on July 2nd, it passes. We declare independence. Okay, now this draft that Jefferson was the main author of, the wording in that draft has to be debated. Some changes are made, and on July 4th, the wording is finalized. So the draft goes down the street to Dunlap printers. He immediately prints up a couple hundred of what are called broadsides. Today we kind of call them posters, to get these immediately out to the country, to Washington to be read to the Army. It's sent overseas. And the date happens to be July 4th, so he dates it July 4th. Where was the Declaration of Independence signed? The bottom of the page. Now that was from my 10-year-old grandson, Zeke Farkas in Boulder, Colorado. Hi, Zeke. Let me ask you another question. Declaration of Independence. What word is not in the Declaration of Independence that you'd bet your life on would be in the Declaration of Independence? How about the word independence? Zeke, thanks again, buddy. So, from the broadside, we eventually have the engrossed, as it's called, copy that we're all familiar with the signatures, etc. So let's go through the house a little bit. In the first room on the left, as you go through the house, this is what I call the war room. Washington spends as much time in this one room as any other room in this house. He's basically in here from morning till night on military business. Now, there's no major fighting in the wintertime. Back in colonial times and earlier, especially in Europe, of course, the two opposing armies would go into what's called winter quarters. They might send out small bands of men for specific purposes, but overall they're stationary. So that's what brings Washington to Morristown, actually for the second time. But at any rate, this is the room where he and his aides conduct the military business that they need to do during the winter to get the armies ready to continue combat in the spring when they leave here. Now, as you look in this room, you look at this picture, on the back wall you see this tall wooden, it's called a secretary, and on the left wall you see a mirror. Now, those are two pieces of furniture that were in this room when Washington was in this room. And those two pieces of furniture are made by a cabinet maker named Chippendale, for those of you who might know antique furniture. There's about a half a dozen pieces of Chippendale furniture in this home. Now, as we go further back, this is a bedroom where the three boys slept, and there's a couple of items in this room that are really pretty funny. The first is this musket. This musket has been documented to 1744, made here in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. Today we just call it Elizabeth. And the musket is composed of three individual pieces. So you've got the barrel, right? Everybody knows what barrel is. You've got the stock, that's the wooden part that rests against your shoulder, and you've got the locking mechanism, as I call it. Those are the metal parts, the trigger and the hammer, etc., that actually fire the musket. Now, these three pieces are made in three separate locations, so they all have to come together into one location. The musket is then assembled, and then it's handed to the soldier, lock, stock, and barrel. You ever heard of that phrase? That's where it originates from. One of my favorite parts, actually in the whole home, is this. Yes, folks, the chamber pot, an early version of a toilet. So I get a lot of kids on tours, and there's this age group from maybe 8 to 13 thereabouts. And I always ask, all right, kids, who can tell me what this is? One little boy said, oh, that's an oversized Starbucks coffee cup. God, love that. So I've also been asked on tours, were there outhouses? And they were called necessaries. So in the daytime, you went outside to the necessary. At night, you used the chamber pot. Going further back into the house, we come to the kitchen area. This is a picture of the kitchen, and it is big. The kitchen doubles as a laundry room. Think about this for a second, because this is where there's hot water going all day. But the kitchen in this house is actually attached to the main house. And I've been asked on tours, weren't colonial kitchens separate for fear of fire? Well, the separate kitchen is really mostly a southern thing, and the intent was not fire, it was heat. Imagine you're in Georgia in the middle of August. The average colonial home starts at about 500 square feet. That's the entire home, by the way. And you're going to have a fire in that home to cook your meals. Imagine how extra hot it is with that fire going. So that's really where the idea of a separate kitchen comes from. Opposite the kitchen is Theodosia's bedroom, where she and her daughter Elizabeth slept. Now, as you look at this picture, straight in a little bit to the right, you see this gold-colored wing chair, and to the right of it on that stand is what's called a fire screen. Those are 2 more pieces of furniture, plus a chair at the table with a plaque. You can see it. Those 3 pieces were in that home when Washington was also in that home. Now, the fire screen serves the purpose of keeping heat off your face when you're in front of a working fire. And I've asked people, it's because it's kind of fun, anybody tell me what the fire screen is for? And a number of people have told me, well, that's to keep the wax makeup that women wore from melting. Well, folks, I hate to tell you this, but colonial women did not wear wax makeup. In fact, colonial women pretty much wore no makeup. So there are a lot of these myths or legends or whatever terms you want to use, and we're gonna talk about a few more as we go through this afternoon. So we go up a few steps and we come to the servants area. And here you see 2 bedrooms. And in these bedrooms, you actually see beds. Now you say, what's the big deal about a bed? Well, in colonial times, the average person did not have a bed. First of all, your home's too small. The average couple had between 7 and 10 children, which I'm going to get back to in a second because it's pretty interesting. So where are you going to put an actual structure? All beds were made individually, one at a time, to fit the person. Custom beds. Who knew, right? So these 2 beds happen to have been a gift to the Park Service. They didn't know where to put them. They put them in here. In reality, most people slept on mattresses. So you can see mattresses on the floor here. And these mattresses were generally filled with hay. So go outside, grab some hay, put it in the mattress, go to bed. At night, you'd lay your mattress down. You would then hit your mattress with a stick to get the bugs out. Now, some of you may remember an expression, when you go to bed, it's time to hit the hay. That's where this expression comes from. Now, children, families. The average couple had between 7 and 10 children. Now, not all survived. Unfortunately, mortality rates were quite high. So that got me interested one day, just how big were families? So I just picked some names to see how large their families were. So Martha Washington was one of 8 children. So in our world today, it's already getting up there. Betsy Ross of the flag, by the way, hate to tell you this, she did not create our first flag. Betsy Ross was one of 17 children. We go upstairs again to the top level. When Washington comes to the Ford Mansion, he brings with him 18 servants. Besides Washington's 18 servants, he comes with 5 aides de camp. Now, an aide de camp in our world today would be like an executive assistant. And the best known of those 5 was Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton spends the entire time here with Washington. Now, while he's here, he's courting Betsy Schuyler, and the home where Betsy spent that winter is just about across the street from where I'm sitting right now. And in the end of June, and at the end of 1780, she and Alexander Hamilton marry. They then wrote a Broadway play, and they made millions of dollars. All right, just kidding. Which brings us to George Washington's bedroom. As you look at this picture, you see the bed. This bed, again, all made by hand. This bed is 6 feet 4 inches long. So the furniture in this room, especially on the left, you see that beautiful bureau or chest of drawers. That's original to that room. Washington probably kept his clothing in there. You see a mirror on the back left wall, again, original to that room. And look on the right, you see, we call it a dressing table. That dressing table was brought upstairs for Martha to use because Martha stayed with George at the Ford Mansion. Now, Martha All 8 winters of the war lasted 8 winters. All 8 winters, wherever her husband was, that's where Martha went. So she comes to the Ford Mansion. And interesting story about Martha, because a lot of people really, when you say Martha Washington, this is the image that they think of. Martha's maiden name was Dandridge. At the age of 18, she marries Daniel Custis. Custis' family was a very wealthy, prominent Virginia family. In 7 years, they had 4 children. I say 7 years because, unfortunately, Daniel dies after 7 years. And in 1750, this is 1757. This is a painting, a drawing of Martha in 1757. And 2 years later, she marries George. Now, when Martha marries George, 2 of her 4 children had already died. The 2 children, there was a boy and a girl. The boy grows up, he marries, and he has 4 children. And one of those 4 was a boy named George Washington Parke Custis. He grows up, and he has a daughter, and his daughter marries Robert E. Lee. If you've ever gone to Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C., which ironically I'm going to be in next weekend, you go look on top of the hill, you'll see this mansion. A lot of people still call it the Custis Lee Mansion, and that's the background. Talking about George Washington, there is a myth that he never slept in a bed because he could never find a bed long enough for a 6'2" frame. It is not true. As I just said earlier, all beds were custom made. George Washington never had children of his own. I'm asked that a lot. No one really knows why not for sure, but he never had children of his own. Washington leaves the Ford Mansion in June of 1780, goes after the British. 1781 is the Battle of Yorktown. That's the last major battle of the war. Washington's army defeats Cornwallis with the help of the French. Most historians, maybe even every historian, agrees without the French, we'd have lost the war. We were running out of everything. We needed, especially a navy. But France agreed finally to help us. The King of France was Louis XVI. Who was his wife? Marie Antoinette, the one French queen that nobody remembers except her name. What did she say that people remember? Let 'em eat cake, right? You're all out there going, yeah, that's what she said. Well, guess what? No. There is no proof she ever uttered those words. 1783, the Treaty of Paris, the war is over. Washington goes home to Mount Vernon. 6 years later, he gets summoned back to New York. New York's the temporary capital at the time, to be sworn in as our first president. He serves 2 terms. He declines to run for a 3rd term. There were a lot of political reasons involved, but basically 2 terms is enough. And that 2 terms becomes tradition for 150 years. It doesn't become law until the 22nd Amendment of 1947. And even then, it's still 2 terms. It's probably just as well, though, because unfortunately, Washington dies 2 years later in 1799. How did Washington die? A lot of people know, and on my tours when I ask this, well, he was sick, he had pneumonia or whatever, and okay, it's kind of on the right track. Washington, in December of 1799, it's a snowy, sleety, rainy, miserable day. He's out all day in Mount Vernon. He comes home, his clothes are soaked, he's not feeling great, but all right. Gets up the next morning, goes out again in the same weather. Now he comes home and he's just not feeling well. He's having trouble talking, he's having trouble breathing, he's having trouble swallowing. He goes to bed, and it gets worse, and it gets worse, and it gets worse. Eventually, 3 doctors come in. From the doctor's notes, doctors today say Washington contracted acute bacterial epiglottitis. Now, your epiglottis is this little flap in your throat. It's really quite tiny. And the function of it is when you swallow, this epiglottis closes over your windpipe so food will not go into your lungs. Instead, food will go into your stomach. So Washington's epiglottis became infected. The infection caused his epiglottis to swell. It swelled over his windpipe and he suffocated to death. Technically, that's how he died. Let's talk about a couple more fun things about George Washington, one of which is his teeth. What were George Washington's false teeth made out of? Yes, all those of you who are saying, yes, it's wood. Never, ever happened. Not wood, not even once. Washington started losing his teeth kind of one at a time in his mid-20s. Again, no one's really sure why. During his presidency, especially his second term, he had no original teeth left. Now, his false teeth, let me show you a picture here. This is the set that's at Mount Vernon. Found a dentist who would make false teeth for him. Now, this was brand new stuff, by the way. You know, today we have implants and crowns and all this stuff. Back then, there was nothing like that. So this dentist makes a set of false teeth. He puts it in George's mouth. Washington opens his mouth, but the teeth just kind of sat there. The dentist was a cool guy. Goes back, he comes back again, and he puts the teeth in George Washington's mouth. Washington opens his mouth, and the teeth open. What did the dentist do? Look at this picture. He put springs, this is an actual set, by the way. He put springs where the upper and lower jaws meet. Can you imagine this in your mouth? Not a lot of fun. I'm going to close this out by talking about the cherry tree. What's the story with the cherry tree? Well, it all starts with this man, Mason Locke Weems. They called him Parson Weems. And after George Washington died in the early 1800s, Parson Weems writes this little booklet, and each chapter is one of George Washington's virtues. And the idea is for younger readers to read it and to try to emulate George Washington. And one of the chapters is about honesty. Father, I cut down the cherry tree, I cannot tell a lie. Now, this is the artist Grant Wood. Some of you may know this name, but you'll probably be familiar with his most famous work of art, American Gothic, right? Now, Grant Wood also did a painting called Parson Weems' Fable. Now, this is Grant Wood's Parson Weems. You can see him there on the right. Now, follow his hand and his finger, and they're pointing to George Washington holding the axe. Now, let's take a look at George Washington, because here you see the artist Gilbert Stuart's 66-year-old head on a 6-year-old body. So what is Grant Wood trying to say? Well, in my opinion, he's trying to say George Washington is timeless, George Washington is ageless, and George Washington orders you to attend my next lecture. So on behalf of myself, thank you. Thank you very much.